So the first thing I want to talk about is give you a historical overview of climate change activism in this country, which is really the result of two parallel but closely related trends in recent history. One is the increasing importance of communication technologies to the collective action process in this country, and the other trend is various changes that have happened in the political environment in this country, especially around environmental issues and climate change. So in terms of the first trend, excuse me, we can divide the modern history of collective action in this country into three distinct eras that are underpinned by three different sort of technological settings. The first one you could call the Union Hall era, and so this is the era before computers and similar technologies were invented. And during this era, we saw a lot of face-to-face organizing, a lot of face-to-face interaction under the umbrella of large chapter-based national organizations. So think, for example, of your typical union with a national union, and then its locals throughout the country, or organizations like the NAACP, or which is a chapter-based organization, or the Sierra Club, which is the oldest environmental organization in this country, and it's also a chapter-based organization. So this is a function of the technology available at the time, right? The most efficient way of doing this type of organizing was through face-to-face regular meetings and through monthly union meeting or things of that sort. The second era you could call the armchair or checkbook era. And the underlying technological trend during this era was advancements that were made in computer technology, especially mainframe computers, and the creation and management of databases. So this era is characterized by large membership organizations headquartered mostly in Washington, D.C., that only ask of their supporters that they support them financially, and then the organizations will do the rest of the advocacy work, mostly through the media or direct lobbying and using tactics of that sort. So this has been called checkbook activism or armchair activism, where you don't have that face-to-face regular connection with the membership base of the organization. All they're doing is supporting the organization financially, and that's it. And some authors, like Robert Putnam, have argued that the loss of that face-to-face regular interaction through civic organizations has led to a decline in social capital in this country. So that may be one consequence of this armchair era. And then the current era where we find ourselves today, you could call the internet or digital era, is an era whose underlying technological trend is widespread availability of the internet at higher speeds, the popularization of the personal computer, smartphones, tablets, devices of these kinds. And the organizational model that we see under this era is much more flexible, hybrid, networked, and it doesn't depend nearly as much on large organizations as the previous eras depended on. So brick and mortar organizations are less central to these processes. So that's in terms of those three eras of collective action in modern history of this country. And that all encompasses the first trend that I was talking about, which is the growing importance of digital technologies to the collective action process in this country. The second trend has to do with changes in the political environment in this country, particularly around environmental issues and climate change. So the 1960s and 70s, the same time we were seeing these advances in mainframe computers and databases and so on, was also an era where environmental organizations had great success in helping pass landmark environmental legislation such as the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. This was when the EPA was formed, and so on. So they had great success during that period of time. These armchair activism organizations. But around the decade of the 2000s, our politics started to become much more polarized around many issues, including environmental issues and particularly climate change. So while Democrats embraced the issue increasingly, Republicans began to run away from the issue increasingly. So this led to an inability by a lot of these armchair activism organizations, excuse me, to inability to make progress on climate change, certainly at the federal level. This led to a lot of dissatisfaction amongst climate activists who began to form their own climate organizations that were dedicated exclusively to climate change advocacy, and they looked a lot like MoveOn.org. For those of you not familiar with MoveOn.org, it is a political organization that has been around since 1998. It was formed to try to stop the impeachment of President Bill Clinton in 1998-99. They circulated an email petition that garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures that asked the Congress to censure the president and move on to other issues. And it's still around as an organization. And MoveOn's model displays great flexibility and organizational hybridity. For example, sometimes it behaves like a political party. In terms that it fundraises for candidates, it does get out the vote operations and things like that. And sometimes it behaves like a social movement where it'll organize protests, rallies, sit-ins, things of that nature. Right now, the most successful climate change advocacy organization in this country, probably the world, is 350.org, which looks a lot like MoveOn.org in terms of the flexibility of its action repertoire and so on. So 350.org was founded by environmental journalist and activist and college professor Bill McKibben at Middlebury College in Vermont, along with some students of his. They founded this organization to fight climate change, and they organized the first International Day of Climate Action in the year 2009, and they were instrumental, they were really central in President Obama's decision to reject the Keystone Pipeline project, which would have brought down tar sands oil, which is some of the dirtiest, most polluting oil that can be extracted and it would have brought it down the middle of the country to the Gulf of Mexico. So they successfully stopped that project, and now 350 is heavily focused on fossil fuel divestment as a tactic. Excuse me. Now, divestment is, to give you just a textbook definition, is a socially responsible investing tactic to remove assets from a sector or industry based on moral objections to its business practices. In this case, the objection being the polluting nature of fossil fuel industries. So the aim of these divestment campaigns is to stigmatize the fossil fuel industry in the same way that divestment stigmatized the apartheid regime in South Africa especially during the 1980s. Activists also argue that there are good financial reasons to divest from fossil fuels. They say that fossil fuel assets could end up becoming stranded assets, meaning assets that have suffered from an unanticipated or premature write-downs, devaluations, or conversions to liabilities. So you have an asset that used to have a certain value, and then all of a sudden it doesn't have any value for whatever reason. So the investor is left holding the bag. So that's what they mean by stranded assets. And to justify this line of thinking, Bill McKibben asked his supporters to do what he calls global warming's terrifying math, in which he gives 3 key numbers. The first is 2 degrees Celsius, which is the amount of warming that we can allow in the atmosphere before we tip over into catastrophic climate change. The second number is 565 gigatons, which is the amount of carbon dioxide that we can put in the atmosphere and safely stay at or under 2 degrees Celsius. And the third number is 2,795 gigatons, which is the amount of proven fossil fuel reserves in the world. So in other words, what they're saying is that if you want to stay at 2 degrees Celsius, that means that 80% of fossil fuel reserves in the world, of proven fossil fuel reserves in the world, have to stay, underground. And they're betting that the world will do something concrete about climate change and force itself to stay at this 565 gigatons. But they're also saying if you continue investing in fossil fuels, then that's a bet, basically a bet for more and more catastrophic climate change. So at the moment, the fossil fuel divestment campaigns have concentrated on college campuses and universities in the US and the UK. Here in the US, 40 colleges and universities have at least partially divested, including University of Maryland, Boston University, Stanford, and Yale. Those have been partial. And in the UK, a quarter of colleges and universities have divested, including Oxford, Cambridge, King's College, and the London School of Economics. And divestment is likely to become an even more popular tactic amongst activists now under the presidency of Donald Trump. So climate activists had many disappointments during the Obama era, including their inability to pass a bill to cap CO2 emissions in this country, or the increase in offshore drilling, among other things. But they had also several successes, like stopping the Keystone Pipeline, like the signing of the Paris Agreement, like the Clean Power Plan that the EPA was supposed to implement until recently. And they were hoping for additional successes under another Democratic administration, but they were disappointed when Donald Trump was elected for the book chapter that I co-authored. I collected several quotes from several different environmental and climate organizations. NRDC said that feeling shell-shocked is an appropriate response. Sarah Cloud said that for people over the country, the pain, anger, and fear at the prospect of a Trump presidency are very real. Greenpeace said that it's not going anywhere, and they're committed to continuing building a movement that fights for the environment, social, racial, and economic justice, and that we're going to get through this together. And 350.org said that the hardest thing to do right now is to hold on to hope, but that is what we most do. So they reacted to Trump's victory with shock, grief, and defiance. And that defiance was seen to a large extent in the streets, the different marches, including their own march, the People's Climate March. But environmental and climate groups were also instrumental in the organization of the Women's Climate March in Washington and the March for Science. And one interesting aspect that I found doing this research about these marches was how present the language of intersectionality was through all of these marches. For those of you not familiar with the familiar with the concept, intersectionality is the notion that multiple identities intersect to create a whole that is different from its constituent parts. This theory proposes that individuals think of each element of trait of a person inextricably linked with all of the other elements in order to fully understand one's identity. So that language kept coming up throughout documents that the organizers of these different marches would put out, like this excerpt from this article in Sierra magazine, excuse me, which says, Cindy Weisner is queer, Latina, and the daughter of an immigrant. She also lives in Miami, where she points out will eventually be underwater because of rising sea levels. Like many people participating in the Women's March on Washington this Saturday, she won't be marching just for women's rights, racial equality, or environmental justice. She'll be marching for all three because she lives a struggle for each. So that reflects that language of intersectionality right there. Or this other example from the diversity principles of the March for Science, which say that inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility are central to the mission and principles of the March for Science. Scientists and people who care about science are an intersectional group, embodying a diverse range of races, sexual orientations, gender identities, abilities, religions, ages, social, economic, and immigration statuses. We, the March organizers, represent and stand in solidarity excuse me, with historically underrepresented scientists excuse me, and science advocates. We are united in our passion to pursue and share knowledge. Or these excerpts from the People's Climate March's core principles would say that they prioritize leadership of frontline communities, communities of color, low-income communities, workers, and others impacted by climate, economic and racial inequality, and that they will build a coordinated but decentralized structure that lifts up a common platform and message while being flexible enough to create more opportunities for connection to local issues, ownership, and engagement in the movement. So that was a very interesting development that we found in these marches, how this language of intersectionality pervaded throughout their foundational documents. In these three publications that I've talked about, we talk about several different challenges that climate activism faces looking ahead. But I'll just concentrate on three challenges here. The first is how to grow these two groups, or rather how to grow one of them at the expense of the other, and how to maximize political mobilization within them. So this is based on research from Centers for Climate Communication at Yale and George Mason University. It's an audience segmentation study that they do every year, and they found that 18% of the American public are alarmed about climate change, whereas 34% are concerned about the issue. But at the same time, only about a quarter of people who are alarmed about climate change have taken even one political action around the issue. So in the meantime, that segment fluctuates between 15 and 18%. So the question is, how can the climate excuse me, how can the climate movement A, mobilize more people within the alarmed segment, and B, how can it grow that segment at the expense of the concerned segment? It's not entirely clear that their strategies at the moment are doing that, or at least not doing the latter of growing the alarm segment, because they have been, as my own research has shown, have been concentrating on strictly mobilizing the alarm segment, really been catering to that particular segment. The second challenge is how to become more effective using social media in an era where it is increasingly becoming an audiovisual medium, where photographs and images, other images of all kinds, and videos are more important than ever. That's another challenge that they face. There's research that shows that there are certain kinds of images that are more likely to elicit sympathy or mobilize people to take action than others. And so another potential next step in research would be finding out what types of audiovisual communication are climate activists using, and how effective is it likely to be based on prior research. And the third challenge is the Trump presidency, and how they will navigate the Trump presidency over the next few years. There seems so that, because it's early in the Trump presidency, that's still an open question. But one of the changes that we've seen is that activists seem to be concentrating a lot on the state and local level. For example, trying to mobilize cities and towns across the country to try to meet the Paris Agreement targets, even if the president pulls the country out of the Paris Agreement. But other than that, exactly how climate activists will navigate the Trump presidency and hold on to as many of their gains as possible, or even make progress, is still an open question. And speaking of questions, I'm glad to take some right now. Thank you very much.
this trend towards digital activism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've been reading a lot in the mass media lately about how, you know, clicktivism and slacktivism and how, you know, we're losing a lot of commitment, particularly in terms of identity,
Right.
As we move away from the monthly meeting,
Right.
union hall model. And I'm wondering how, if that maybe first of all, what your thoughts are on that, and whether you think that maps on at all to this tension between sort of preaching to the choir and those who are already alarmed, as opposed to broadening the base of the movement.
Right. I think that the concern about over collectivism is overstated, because most digital, organizers, most political organizers will tell you that digital tactics are just one type of tactic that they use, and that ideally, excuse me, ideally, those would be part of what they call a ladder of engagement, where you use easier tactics like you know, click here to sign this petition or something like that, to bring people along and then get them to do more complex or time-consuming actions. I think that the concern is overstated, because most organizers, at least those worth their salt, are probably deploying digital tactics as part of a repertoire that includes many other types of tactics. And what was the second part of your question? I'm sorry.
This idea of prioritizing those who are already alarmed.
Right, right. Well, I think that there is some value to that strategy. It kind of depends on the issue. There's some value to that strategy, because a lot of times it's not about how many people you have on your side, but how committed they are. So take the example of gun control. You know, the vast majority of people in this country, if you ask them in an opinion poll, do you support, you know, the more sort of mainstream forms of gun control, right? Like closing the gun show loophole, you know, instant checks, things like that. They overwhelmingly favor them. So the people who oppose those are in the minority, but they are intense in their opposition to those measures. So when come election time, or when there's a legislative battle, they tend to be the ones that show up and do and really become engaged with the issue. So levels of intensity are definitely very important. But on the other hand, climate change is an issue that is so all-encompassing. You know, we're talking about really completely restructuring our economy. And it touches on so many areas of our economy and our society that there's some real value in just growing the overall number of people who are concerned about. So then we're not even just talking about moving people over from the concerned segment to the alarm segment. It's growing that concerned segment, right? So I think it depends on the issue. On an issue like climate change, I think both are going to be important, both growing the overall number of people who are concerned about it at least, but at the same time mobilizing politically the people who do feel, you know, more intensely about it already. Yes?
communication specialist, can you comment on how incredibly successful the conversion of, or perversion of the clearly scientific support, the data clearly supports that human influence climate change is significant.
Right.
Yet the communication has perverted that and called into question all of that information in a similar manner that smoking is good for your health, et cetera,
Right,
et cetera.
right. Yeah.
So my background is science.
Okay.
I understand the data. I am completely befuddled by how communication has perverted that into, dismissive, doubtful, disengaged.
Well, I think part of the issue with that is that there has been a very successful effort by fossil fuel companies to model the consensus, which stands at, I think, between 97 and 99% of scientists or climate scientists agree that climate change is happening as caused by human activity. But there has been a very concerted effort by fossil fuel companies to fund research that calls that consensus into question, and that has been embraced by the political right in this country. And
But that's changed. All of the big oil companies now
Right.
are on board. So why
Right.
hasn't it shifted?
Well, it hasn't shifted because now your stance on this issue has become part of your identity in this sort of tribalism, period of tribalism that we're living through right now. So, dismissing climate change has become another way of sticking it to liberals or something like that, And it's really, even if fossil fuel companies were truly concerned about making the switch to renewable energy or curbing emissions or things like that, at the moment, I think it's too late. I think that our position has become ingrained in certain segments of the population that's become so ingrained that it's now become part of a cluster of issues that determines their identity as a conservative or something like that. So they've really done something that is out of their hands now. And the way that the media covers the issue hasn't really helped because they've resorted to this false balance and bringing two climate experts, one a supporter of the consensus, the other a skeptic, and when in fact their qualifications are not, that debate doesn't reflect the actual consensus.
Right.
It's not as if it's a 50-50 proposition, but people, and this is where you see, people who are doubtful maybe see it as I just saw these two guys on CNN recently, and one of them was really sure that it wasn't happening, so I'm not a scientist, why get all bothered if, at least half scientists don't think that this is happening, which is not the case. But the way that the press has represented the issue has represented a lot of false balance in its coverage, and that's really been one of the main drivers of this, I think. Thank you for your question. Jamie?
I think that one thing that we see right now, and one of the strategies of the Trump administration, of Trump, is to fragment us as much as we can, right? And for me, when I see this, climate activism, there are so many things to be activist about right now, right? I mean, we can be activist about immigration, we can be activist about healthcare, we can be activist about treatment of women, we can be active, I'm sure discrimination, all of those different things, exactly like Black Lives Matter, all of that. There are so many things to be activist about. And how, I almost feel as though everything kind of gets diluted or can become diluted because it's like, how can we be working for everything at the same time?
Right.
And that's kind of, I guess, my question here is how, and actually Sarah, you do so much work on coalitions, right? And, like activism in that sense. But so I guess I just wonder how this is working right now under the administration and,
I think that's something that everyone who works on this space has to struggle with. And not only that, but they have to struggle with fatigue setting in, activist fatigue setting in, and people just becoming bogged down in all the bad news. I know that I cringe whenever I get an alert from my news alerts on my phone. It's like, what is that now? What happened, So I think there's a real danger of fatigue setting in, not just fragmentation of attention, that's one problem, but the other is fatigue. I think there's a real problem that could set in across all of these different areas of activism, for sure.
I think part of the surprisingly good news on this slide is how small the percentage of people who are disengaged is.
Right. That's true, yeah. That's true.
And when was this? This was in November 2016. I would be interested
Before all the hurricanes.
Oh, right. I would be interested to see if that number is going up this year because this was, as the election was happening then, right?
Yeah.
And I feel that, people are likely to become more and more disengaged because we just kind of feel like hopeless, like you know what I mean? Like I can't do everything, so I'm just gonna I wouldn't be surprised with the level of disengagement with all of these issues. Especially from people who aren't affected personally by the issues.
It would.
There are more people affected, themselves is affected personally by climate change.
Right.
It would be interesting to see how all of the different weather events affect this mix, although this has been pretty consistent for the last 5 years or something like that, or more, that they have been conducting the survey. It's been pretty consistent. The proportions change a little bit, but overall, well, the numbers change a little bit, but the proportions stay pretty much the same. It's been pretty consistent. Yes, in the back?
I would just note that, as you mentioned before, climate change has both been responsible for polarizing factions early on, but yet at the same time, when you look at the most recent marches, there's a lot of, as you say, intersectionality. And I even find that here in San Antonio. So I would note that's something that at least acts in some sense as a balance to some of the fragmentation that we do see.
Right. Yeah, I think that it's no coincidence that you're seeing so much emphasis on intersectionality amongst activists. I think that you're seeing that because for a long time there's been a tendency amongst the left for people to engage only with one particular issue that they care about, and this is a bid by, say, climate activists to get people who are interested in reproductive rights, who may not otherwise engage in activism, or would only engage in activism, and when it comes to reproductive rights, to maybe become engaged with climate change as well, and vice versa. So I think it's no coincidence that you're seeing this kind of language from these different groups now. Yes?
Is it fair to say, along the lines of what you were saying, is it fair to say there's an anti-science view or tribe out there now that poo-poos the science
Well,
and
it's
adopts
not,
an ideology instead?
it's not that they're anti-science in a blanket way. It's that there are certain scientific issues today that are on the agenda today that it's when science comes into conflict with some sort of conflict with your most most deeply held values, that becomes a problem. So, so with climate change, for example, one of the fears that people who oppose climate action have is that it would entail a lot more government intervention in the economy. So if you're a conservative, it's easier to not even engage with the issue, you know, because it upsets your worldview too much. But I don't think that people are, that there's a core of people out there who are just turning away from science completely. If they get sick, they'll go to the doctor. If they have cancer, they'll get treatment. That's all putting yourselves in the hands of science. You know, they still trust weather forecasts and so on. But it's when particular science issues conflict with someone's worldview, deeply held worldview, then that can become a problem. And I think that's what we're seeing here today. And of course, there has to be other agents that exacerbate that conflict, like what we talked about with the fossil fuel companies sowing doubt about the research and so on, and political leaders politicizing the issue when it really shouldn't be a partisan political issue. So those things don't help. But I think that it's on particular issues, and when you see that conflict between what the implications of the science and your worldview is when there's a problem. And that's what's happening with climate change.
Is there anybody that tracks people's view about science?
Well, I mean, there are. I just off the top of my head, I don't know their names off the top of my head, but there are definitely. There's countless research about that. Do you have a yes?
So, you gave an example of divestment and South African apartheid as a strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And that, the impact of that divestment took decades.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the climate issue cannot afford that length of time to reach a tipping point where change happens. Do you have any historical examples from other, I don't know what to call it, critical issues where a more rapid change of mind took place, and what led to that?
I can think of the example of same-sex marriage. That was an issue where as a country, we went from being against same-sex marriage by 10 points to being for same-sex marriage by 10 points in the opinion polls in the space of 10 years. And what I personally think that what accelerated, I mean, there might be research that contradicts this, but I think that my personal opinion is that what accelerated that change was the sheer number of Americans that started coming out to their friends and family, and then more and more Americans started seeing, oh, I have a gay nephew, I have a lesbian daughter, I work, with a transgender person, and all these things, So once those people aren't some abstract menace, but they're like people that you know, then it becomes a lot harder to deny them equality.
So it's going to take many more Marias to.
Maybe unfortunately, that's what it will take. We'll have to see how these disasters have moved the numbers. I don't know off the top of my head how they moved the numbers, but also the thing is that those ebb and flow. You know, the change doesn't tend to be permanent, whereas these numbers do tend to be pretty stable. You know, the number of people who are concerned about climate change or something like that tends to spike during disasters, then it goes back. Right? You know, so honestly, I don't know what it would take to get that kind of conversion in, say, 10 years or something like that. Sorry, you're saying.
If we have another hurricane season next year, like we've had this year.
Right. I mean, maybe a pattern, maybe a very clear pattern of something like that. But the weather is the weather. You know, it's unpredictable. We're not unpredictable, but to some extent it is. So we can't depend on that. Right. Yes. Did you have another?
I would just comment that while I don't know the time span, I think disinvestment on the Kruger end was impactful in South African politics and apartheid issues. So like I say, I don't know the time span.
Okay.
But I'd also ask if there's a divestment movement on UTSA's campus. I mean, it must be student-led. I would imagine for it to be, its origins would be in the student groups.
Right. I think I remember seeing like I haven't seen strong evidence of an actual, you know, strong movement here. I may have seen like a Twitter account or something like that, or a webpage of some sort that talked about that, but
There's no one in the room that would have knowledge of that, none of the students? You don't know about it? Yeah, well, that's the answer right there.
Right. So no, it's not. The divestment movement has been most successful really in small liberal arts colleges that don't have big endowments and can afford to take that sort of principled stance. It's been less successful with bigger universities that do a lot of research. It hasn't been successful at Harvard, for example, or MIT. Excuse me. So it really depends on the situation, like where it's located in the country, and so on.
There is a UTSA divestment petition, and it has 185 signatures.
Right. That must have been what I saw. I searched for that early on when I came here.
And how long has that been in process?
Probably for a while.
Do you know? You may not know.
Probably for a while.
Well, since the Romo administration.
Okay.
Right. So yeah, there basically isn't a movement here. Yeah. Okay. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I want to thank all of you for coming here today. I really appreciate it, and I hope you got something out of this research talk. Thank you.